With Marco Rubio set to meet his Danish counterpart in Washington next week, Vance has hit back at Danish and European leaders for failing to engage with the US argument Greenland is critical for global security. Watch.
People don't realize this. The entire missile defense infrastructure is partially dependent on Greenland. If, God forbid, the Russians or the Chinese, not saying they're going to, but if, God forbid, in the future, somebody launched a nuclear missile into our continent, they launched a nuclear missile at Europe, Greenland is a critical part of that missile defense. So you ask yourself, have the Europeans, have the Danes done a proper job of securing Greenland and making sure it can continue to serve as an anchor for world security and missile defense? And the answer is obviously they haven't.
This was the ex-post that sent shockwaves through Europe with just one word: soon. Katie Miller's husband is Stephen Miller, Donald Trump's White House Deputy Chief of Staff for Policy and Homeland Security Advisor. And here's Trump himself.
We need Greenland from a national security situation. It's so strategic. Right now, Greenland is covered with Russian and Chinese ships all over the place. We need Greenland from the standpoint of national security. And Denmark is not going to be able to do it, I can tell you that.
But Greenland, Denmark and European leaders have told Trump to stop the talk of annexation and that Greenland is not up for sale. The Danish Prime Minister also had this warning.
For det første så mener jeg, at man skal tage den amerikanske præsident alvorligt, når han siger, at han ønsker Grønland. Men jeg vil også gøre klart, at hvis USA vælger at angribe et andet NATO-land militært, så hører alting op. Altså inklusiv vores NATO og dermed den sikkerhed, som er blevet tilvejebragt siden afslutningen på 2. verdenskrig.
Why is Greenland so crucial for missile defense and US national security? How will this fallout between Europe and the US impact the NATO alliance? And is China misleading the international community about Trump's security warnings by saying it has little involvement in Greenland? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. To discuss this and more, I'm joined by Tony Hu, former US Department of Defense Senior Director for China, Taiwan and Mongolia, and Marcin Jezewski, European Values Center for Security Policy, Taiwan Office Head. A very warm welcome back, both of you, to Taiwan Talks.
Thank you.
Greenland is the world's largest island, sitting between North America and Russia, sparsely populated with only between 56 and 57,000 residents. Now, this is Pittuffik Space Base on Greenland. It is central to the security considerations around Greenland. Here, the US Space Force conducts critical missile warning, missile defense and space surveillance using powerful radars and satellite tracking, leveraging its top-of-the-world location. The US military's NORAD, or North American Aerospace Defense Command, manages the US's northernmost installation, which includes a deep-water port, airfield and facilities focusing on space domain awareness and security. In June 2025, the US military moved Greenland from European Command, EUCOM, to Northern Command, NORTHCOM, reflecting its role as a frontline defense of the US homeland. As of January 2026, the Trump administration has designated Greenland a national security priority to deter Russian and Chinese influence in the Arctic. Tony, let me come to you first. So Vance says Greenland serves, let me quote, as an anchor of world security and missile defense. And Trump says it is so important, so strategically important. Help us understand why.
Well, first of all, the Earth is a little bit flat. So going from the north end is actually the shortest route. So if China or Russia wants to launch missiles against the United States or anywhere in North America, it will go through the pole. Now, right now we have in Alaska early warning and also in Greenland. So it has the total monitoring of the whole northern area. And therefore, Greenland is actually really important because on any attack, you want to have a double verification. So you want both sides to be able to see it. And in Alaska, in Clear Air Force Station, we have an early warning radar there, and as in Pittuffik. And also in Alaska, at Fort Greenlee, we have ground-based missile interceptors, so that when these sensors, this big radar, sees missiles coming from the north, these interceptors will be able to shoot it down. I suspect what Trump is thinking is maybe building additional interceptors on Greenland, because right now those interceptors on Alaska can capture majority of the missiles, but others from further to the other side, they might miss it.
So in terms of space orbits, is it true that, you know, the Arctic is where both of these space orbits as well as the missile trajectories, that it sits under both of these? So
for satellites, we will have the orbits around the Earth, but we also have polar orbit satellites that go around, that actually scan the entire Earth by going around this way, up and down through Arctic and Antarctic. So each of these satellites, when they see something, they have to downlink the information. So we need downlink station. And also you need the control stations that can fly it in case you need to move it. Okay, so you can only do that if the downlink station and control station can see the satellite. So once if it's on the other side of the Earth, you can't see it. So we have many stations all over the place, but on the northern area, that's it.
So that's the best vantage point.
Exactly, that's very, very important.
Yeah, so Martin, the next question, very important question is, so, you know, what is it about US ownership of Greenland, which is what Donald Trump wants, versus keeping Denmark and Greenland as allies?
This is really a crucial question, and I, for one, doubt how ownership of Greenland would make it easier for the United States to pursue such endeavors in defense buildup, for example, by constructing a new series of interceptors, as we just heard, versus a new deal with Greenland.
I guess the argument from the Trump administration is that, you know, on allied territory, any expansion, which perhaps they have plans for big expansion, would require renegotiation. There would be public backlash. You know, there would be delays. Isn't this just a case of them wanting sort of unity of command?
I fully agree with your interpretation that this might be the goal that the US administration has in mind, but at the end of the day, we should understand that even the Danish control over Greenland is an example of settler colonialism. Greenland belongs to indigenous Inuit people, and in recent years we have seen very clear examples of mobilization along ethnic lines and calls for greater respect for traditional rights and autonomy of indigenous inhabitants of Greenland. Of course, I'm fully cognizant of the fact that the Trump administration might not be big on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but this level of public backlash would still happen, even if it doesn't occur among the publics in mainland Denmark, so to say. The indigenous movement of traditional owners of Greenland would definitely derail some of these plans, at least to a minor extent.
Right, okay. Tony, why do you believe there is the urgency now?
I think, well, one thing, one of the reasons Trump wants Greenland is for the minerals. So reduce the dependency on China for rare earth, for example, is one of the urgencies we have. The other is the way that China and Russia have expressed, especially China, to express their interest in the Arctic. You know, China called itself a near Arctic state, and they have dispatched a lot of ships in the area doing survey and stuff. So I think Trump is concerned if they actually exert more power in that region, more influence in the region. Of course, 7 of the 8 countries that have properties, the landmass in the Arctic Circle are NATO members. So I'm not sure how valid is that concern, but I certainly believe Trump would like to be able to control some of the critical choke points, like the Denmark Strait between Greenland and Iceland. It's a choke point for Russian ships going down into the Pacific and Atlantic area, or rather. So I think he wants to have U.S. control just because he feels U.S. would like to do all this. In his mind, he wants to do many of the things alone, instead of counting on allies.
Okay, and Martin, I mean, how much of it is, you know, wanting to maintain momentum, say, after the attack on Venezuela, and also, you know, their new Monroe or Donroe doctrine, which is control of the Western Hemisphere?
I absolutely see this new push to acquire Greenland as a part of a bigger project of asserting hemispheric control by the United States. However, I think it is also really crucial to distinguish the original Monroe Doctrine from this new avatar of the Monroe Doctrine, because the non-interference principle in the original Monroe Doctrine actually has two prongs. Of course, it referred to an effort by the United States in the early 19th century to limit European expansionism in the Western Hemisphere and defining the Western Hemisphere as Washington's backyard. But it also included a component of non-interference in the territories that were already controlled by Europeans at the time. So in a way, this effort to capture a territory that is an inherent part of a European ally has little to do with the original formulation of the Monroe Doctrine and embodies
it goes against the spirit of the original.
It goes against the spirit of the original, so that's why the Monroe Doctrine is not the Monroe Doctrine.
Okay. Now, Tony, how much of it is also the development of hypersonic missiles? You know, is there an urgency created?
If our enemies in Russia or China use hypersonic and come through the poles, you want to detect it early because you have satellite basically and pick up the minute of the launch when they get off the ground, and you want to be able to detect it and track it so that our defense system can engage early. Therefore,
how does it differ to the ICBMs from the Cold War era, and what does it require in order to track? Because I understand it can change direction, the hypersonic missiles.
Well, actually, it doesn't change direction per se. It changes altitude because they still fly in the same direction. They don't go sideways that much. The fact is, it doesn't change that much because you know it's coming, you know the direction is coming. The only reason is you can't intercept it as well because it changes. Well, ballistic have a predictable path. Well, the hypersonic glide ones that it moves, so you don't have a regular path. You have a direction, but you don't have the altitude. You need both to intercept it. So that's the difficulty. And does the Greenland issue actually improve that much?
I mean, perhaps. Do you think that the US military actually just wants to pack that the space that they have with a lot more sensors, a lot more interceptors, basically create a like continental-style early warning platform?
Yeah, I think so. I think actually, if you look at the base, the Pittuffik base now, there are areas that you can expand and build those shooters. But like I said, I suspect it has more to do with the mineral that we need.
Okay. Now, a CNBC report said Russia owns 53% of the Arctic coastline, with the Pentagon warning that Moscow has been investing heavily in military infrastructure in the Arctic, with an estimated 50 military or dual-use bases operating. Russia's Northern Fleet numbers around 70 nuclear submarines and surface warships and is deployed to protect its Arctic infrastructure, as well as the Northern Sea Route, which is projected to see upward of 50 million tons of cargo this year, increasing every year as the ice melts. Meanwhile, Beijing has also expanded its activities there in recent years, labeling itself a near-Arctic state, as Tony mentioned, under its so-called Polar Silk Road as a branch of its Belt and Road Initiative. China operates the Yellow River Station at Svalbard, Norway, supporting year-round scientific and environmental research, and runs polar research vessels like Xuelong 2, which the US Coast Guard recently tracked north of Alaska. However, Chinese government sources, naval experts, and Western analysis suggests that China's Navy and Coast Guard are operating more frequently in Arctic waters, including patrols and joint exercises with Russia in seas such as the Bering Sea. Martin, let me come to you. So China has rejected, there's an article in the Global Times, Trump's statement that Russian and Chinese ships surround Greenland. But do you think that this is, sort of diverting or misdirecting people from the security threat that Trump has outlined?
I definitely believe that there are security threats associated with growing Chinese and Russian presence in the Arctic. Of course, the geography is another issue. Most of the highest presence of Chinese and Russian vessels is in the Barents and Bering Sea, so some distance away from Greenland. Nevertheless, we should not lose sight of the fact that some of the most pressing non-traditional security threats are related to environmental degradation, and both China and Russia, on top of just the sheer desire for material control of the Arctic region, also have very ambitious plans for explorations of very robust deposits of critical raw materials that are in the Arctic, not only in Greenland, and also potentially drilling for Arctic oil reserves. And this type of interference with very volatile environments would be of tremendous detriment to humankind at large. So it's not a threat specific to any individual nation state.
Some analysts do say that we need to change our thinking of the Arctic. The Arctic always was very periphery, but actually it's central. They talk about it as being the linchpin, even between the South China Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. I just want to quote from an Atlantic Council article. They say Greenland is the geostrategic linchpin connecting the Arctic, North America, and Europe. At the same time, they also say that the melting ice caps allow movement of Russian and Chinese military ships between the Pacific and the Atlantic.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, if something happened in Europe and US forces in Alaska or in Asia want to support Europe, they'll have to go through the Arctic, right on top of it. And during recent exercise where we deploy European forces in an Asia scenario, where the second wave of forces coming in, we deploy the European forces, US forces in Europe into the Asia region through Alaska, you go through the Arctic. So if adversary controls that area, they can interrupt this mutual support, the forces movement, okay? That's why it is important, because just in case we get into a conflict with China, where continental US forces come to Asia, and European forces come to it. Did you know, actually, from Alaska, the distance from Alaska to Frankfurt is actually very short from Germany. So our forces in Germany fly into Alaska, and I've done that mission from Hawaii to Alaska to Germany and back. It's very much shorter than going through the fat part of the Earth. So it is critical, as you indicated. Therefore, making sure it's still open and free for us to do what we need to do, it's important for both sides.
Right. And so, Tony, do you think, rather than just perhaps wanting to put in more sensors and create this early warning platform, is it that they just simply want to, build an entire new military headquarters, possibly recognizing the importance of the Arctic for US homeland defense?
I think we just want to make sure it's accessible. Because building the entire headquarters and forces up there, it might be a very expensive adventure that doesn't really have a day-to-day function per se, where the deterrence in the European side, standing right at the border, Poland, in case the Russians come through, right around Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, in case the China do something foolish. That type of real-time deterrence is important. The northern part, like I say, it basically controls the movement of forces, and the monitoring type activities, it's not as critical day-to-day. So if you put your forces day-to-day there, then you are reducing forces somewhere else. So that is a consideration, whether we want to do that or not.
Right. And Marcin, trying to understand it from the US's point of view in terms of that national security and perhaps what they want to, expand on Greenland doesn't mean that it's right. In a previous show, our guest rejected the parallel between Venezuela and Taiwan. What is your take on the situation that Greenland finds itself and Taiwan's situation?
I definitely believe that, there are some parallels that we can draw on. The first one that comes to mind is the point that I raised earlier about the dynamics with indigenous populations. It seems like neither the indigenous populations of Greenland nor those of Taiwan are really asked about their opinion, and this only further cements the perception of these two land masses as mere pawns in geopolitical dealings. But I think that more importantly, the events such as the ones in Venezuela, or now the threat of US annexation of Greenland, are normalizing in the international system the dominance of strength over principles. And this creates very difficult precedents.
Okay. Now, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has argued that the Arctic states share the responsibility for Arctic security. Listen.
Jeg er enig i, at det er vigtigt, at der er sikkerhed og fred og tryghed i det arktiske område. Det er jo derfor en af grundene til, at vi er med i NATO. Grønland er også med i NATO. Det er et fælles ansvar for de arktiske stater herunder kongeriget at sørge for, at der er sikkerhed og fred og frihed i det arktiske område. Men Danmark har altid været en god allieret til USA. Det ønsker vi fortsat at være. Men jeg bliver også nødt til at anholde noget af det, der bliver sagt fra amerikansk side, og vi vil selvfølgelig ikke affinde os med en situation, hvor man truer os og Grønland på den her måde.
Donald Trump has responded this way. Russia and China have zero fear of NATO without the United States, and I doubt NATO would be there for us if we really needed them. Everyone is lucky that I rebuilt our military in my first term and continue to do so. We will always be there for NATO, even if they won't be there for us. The only nation that China and Russia fear and respect is the Donald J. Trump rebuilt USA. Tony, so Trump is saying that the US can only rely on itself when it comes to hemispheric and global security. What's your view about that?
Yeah, that's President Trump's perception that every other country is taking advantage of the United States, which is not true. If you look at during the past 80 years, every major conflict, I'm talking about major conflict, not small ones like Venezuela, we have entered with a coalition of friends, okay? In the Middle East, Gulf War, NATO were there. All those countries were participating. And even Vietnam, or if you go back to Korea, our NATO partners were there. So it's not a fair statement. And collective defense actually is the best deterrence. And no, Russia is worried about NATO. And whether the United States is there or not, NATO is obviously stronger with the U.S. presence, but they are a very capable force, okay? They're not like nobody. So the way that President Trump described that Russia is not scared of NATO, I think Russia is, because NATO in and by itself is also a nuclear power, right? The French and the Brits, they all have nuclear weapons. So that's not a fair statement, and I think
there's been a shift, isn't there, Tony, in terms of the U.S. policy, because the Arctic strategy, the previous, well, the current U.S. Arctic strategy is very much about allies and alliances.
Exactly.
Marcin, Trump or the White House has said that force is not off the table, but no one seriously thinks the U.S. will use force against NATO member Greenland or Denmark. But I wanted to pull back a little bit. In terms of Taiwan's perspective, Taiwan's interests are for the US to be strong. Taiwan's interests are for the US to deter power projection from China and Russia. However, when it comes to what's happening now over Greenland, even before or even without force, how are these discussions impacting NATO as a military alliance and its functioning, and what could be the implications?
I think that we are now in a stage where NATO is doing a lot of soul searching about the future shape of the alliance. NATO has evolved to be a body that rests on two pillars concurrently. So it is a security and defense alliance, but it is also a political alliance. I believe that the Trump administration is strongly undermining the political integration pillar of the NATO, and is by extension also undermining the importance of threats other than purely kinetic ones to national security. That is undermining many years of not only research but also actual practice by people in uniform who have seen that the emergence of new domains of modern warfare, including cyber warfare or various iterations of political warfare, can be just as destructive to national security interests of NATO allies as these kinetic threats. And this effort or this consequence of Trump's administration's reshaping thinking about NATO and thinking within NATO about what the bloc should be has implications for security of Taiwan itself. So particularly as we recognize that the main source of security threats for Taiwan is the People's Liberation Army, which we need to understand is not a traditional armed force of a nation state, but rather an armed wing of a political party of the Chinese Communist Party.
Tony, you wanted to jump in?
Yes, when we talk about NATO, most people think about defense of Europe. But North Atlantic Treaty Organization included defense of Canada and United States. And I think that's another portion where Trump forgets, that it actually helped defend North America. So I'm very worried, as Marcin indicated, that NATO as an organization might be seriously impacted. And another part of me is hoping it will recover in 3 years.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap up there. Apologies to Marcin, we didn't have time to talk about the Compacts of Free Association, which is what Palau and Marshall Islands, also Taiwan allies, have the arrangement with the US over. Thank you so much, Tony Hu.
Thank you.
And Marcin Yuzewski for joining Taiwan Talks. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.